Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates were worried about makeup and dating, she was doing push-ups in her backyard and studying military history. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, had raised her with discipline and respect for service members. Every morning, she would wake up before dawn to run 5 miles, a habit that started when she was just 14 years old. The tattoo on her left shoulder blade was small but meaningful. It showed a trident with an anchor, surrounded by an eagle's wings. Most people who saw it at the beach or gym didn't know what it meant. To them, it looked like just another decorative design that young people got these days. But Sarah knew exactly what it represented, and she wore it with quiet pride. She had gotten the tattoo on her 21st birthday, exactly 3 years after completing one of the most challenging military training programs in the world. The artist who did the work was a former Navy man himself, and when Sarah showed him the design, his eyes had widened with respect. He didn't ask questions, but his careful attention to every detail showed he understood the significance of what he was permanently marking on her skin. Working at the local community center as a fitness instructor, Sarah kept her past mostly to herself. She helped elderly people with water aerobics, taught teenage girls self-defense, and ran boot camp classes for anyone brave enough to sign up. Her students loved her because she was tough but fair, pushing them to be better while never making them feel ashamed of their limitations. The trouble started on a busy Saturday morning in July. The community center was hosting a Veterans Appreciation event, and Sarah was helping set up tables and chairs in the main hall. She wore a tank top because the Texas heat was already unbearable at 9 in the morning, and the tattoo was clearly visible as she moved folding chairs into neat rows. Marcus Webb, a local man in his 50s who claimed to be a military expert, noticed the tattoo first. He had never served in the military himself, but he spent most of his free time on internet forums discussing military topics and correcting people about uniform regulations and military protocols. He considered himself an authority on all things related to the armed forces, despite having no actual experience beyond what he read online. "Excuse me, miss," Marcus said, walking up to Sarah with a smug expression. "I couldn't help but notice your tattoo. Do you mind if I ask what unit you served with?" Sarah paused in her work, setting down a chair carefully. She had dealt with this type of question before, though usually not so directly. "I'd rather not discuss my service," she said politely, hoping to end the conversation before it became uncomfortable. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with that answer. He had seen enough military movies and read enough articles to convince himself that he could spot a fake from a mile away, and this young woman, barely looking old enough to have completed basic training, definitely seemed suspicious to him. "That's interesting," he said, his voice getting louder so that other volunteers could hear. "Because that looks like a Navy SEAL trident to me, and I happen to know that women aren't allowed in the SEALs. So either you're lying about your service, or you're wearing a tattoo you didn't earn." The conversations around them began to stop as people turned to see what was happening. Sarah felt her face getting warm, but she kept her voice steady. "Like I said, I'd prefer not to discuss my military background. Is there something I can help you with regarding the event setup?" Marcus sensed that he had an audience now, and his confidence grew. He had always enjoyed being the center of attention, especially when he could demonstrate his supposed expertise. "Ma'am, stolen valor is a serious crime. Military members earn their insignia through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. For someone to pretend they served, especially in an elite unit like the SEALs, is deeply disrespectful to real heroes." Other volunteers were starting to gather around, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her tattoo. Some looked curious, others seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation, but a few were beginning to nod in agreement with Marcus. She had hoped to avoid this kind of situation, but it seemed there was no escape now. "I understand your concern about honoring military service," Sarah said carefully, "but I think there might be some misunderstanding here. The only misunderstanding is you thinking you can fool people with that fake tattoo," Marcus shot back. "I've studied military history for years. I know every insignia, every medal, every qualification badge, and I know for a fact that no woman has ever completed SEAL training. It's physically impossible." An older man named Frank, who was a Korean War veteran, stepped forward. He had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort. "Now hold on, Marcus. Maybe we should mind our own business here. The young lady doesn't owe us any explanations." But Marcus was just getting started. "Frank, with all due respect, this is exactly our business. Our veterans deserve better than having some fitness instructor pretend she earned the right to wear a SEAL trident. Next thing you know, she'll be telling people she was some kind of special operations hero. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice calm. I've never claimed to be a hero, and I've never told anyone stories about my service. I'm just here to help set up for a veterans event. Then why are you wearing that tattoo? Marcus demanded. If you really served, prove it. Show us your discharge papers, your service record, something that backs up what you're advertising on your skin. The crowd was growing larger now, and Sarah realized that word of the confrontation was spreading throughout the community center. She could see people pointing and whispering, and she knew that by the end of the day, everyone in town would have heard some version of this story. I don't carry my military documents around with me, she said quietly, and I shouldn't have to prove anything to anyone. My service is my own business. Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. Of course you don't have documents, because they don't exist. Look, lady, I don't know where you got that tattoo or who told you it would make you look tough, but you picked the wrong design to fake. The SEAL trident means something. It represents men who pushed their bodies and minds to the absolute limit, who earned the right to call themselves America's elite warriors. You wearing that symbol is like spitting in their faces. Frank tried to intervene again. Marcus, that's enough. You've made your point. Let's just get back to setting up for the event. But other people in the crowd were starting to take sides. A woman named Betty, who had 2 sons in the army, stepped forward with an angry expression. If this girl is pretending to be a SEAL, that's disgusting. My boys are risking their lives overseas while she's playing dress-up with fake tattoos. Another man, who introduced himself as a Marine veteran, crossed his arms and stared at Sarah with suspicion. I've got to agree with Marcus here. Something doesn't add up. If she really earned that tattoo, why won't she just tell us about her service? Real veterans are proud to talk about their time in the military. Sarah felt trapped. She was surrounded by people who were growing more hostile by the minute, all demanding that she prove something she shouldn't have to prove. The irony wasn't lost on her that this was happening at an event meant to honor veterans, but she was being attacked for her own service. Please, she said, looking around at the crowd. I came here to volunteer my time to help honor veterans. I didn't come here to be put on trial about my personal history. Can we please just focus on the event? But Marcus wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and began typing quickly. I'm posting about this on the Veterans Truth Facebook page. There are thousands of real veterans on there who will be very interested to hear about someone in Texas wearing a fake SEAL tattoo. They don't take kindly to pretenders. Sarah's heart sank as she watched him typing. She knew that within hours her photo and location would be shared across social media, along with accusations that she was guilty of stolen valor. The internet had a long memory and little patience for nuance or truth when it came to these kinds of stories. You're making a mistake, she said quietly, but her voice was lost in the growing chatter of the crowd. The community center director, Mrs. Johnson, finally arrived to see what was causing the commotion. She was a kind woman in her 60s who had known Sarah for 2 years and had always been impressed by her dedication and professionalism. What's going on here? Mrs. Johnson asked, looking around at the crowd of agitated volunteers. Marcus immediately launched into his explanation, describing how he had uncovered what he believed to be a case of stolen valor. He spoke with the confidence of someone who was certain he was doing the right thing, exposing a fraud who had been hiding in plain sight. This young woman is wearing a Navy SEAL tattoo, he concluded, and when I asked her about her service, she refused to provide any proof. It's obvious she's a fake, and I think we need to ask her to leave before she embarrasses this event any further. Mrs. Johnson looked at Sarah with confusion and concern. She had never known Sarah to lie about anything, and she seemed like the last person who would try to deceive people about military service. But the crowd was clearly upset, and she needed to find a way to diffuse the situation. Sarah, is there anything you'd like to say to clear this up? Mrs. Johnson asked gently. Sarah looked around at all the faces staring at her expectantly. Some looked angry, some looked disappointed, and a few looked sympathetic but uncertain. She realized that anything she said would probably make the situation worse, but staying silent was being interpreted as an admission of guilt. Mrs. Johnson, I've been volunteering here for 2 years, she said finally. You know my character. I would never dishonor veterans or claim service I didn't earn.
But I also don't think I should have to provide military documents to volunteer at a community center. Marcus shook his head vigorously.
That's exactly what someone with something to hide would say. If she's innocent, why won't she just prove it? As the argument continued, more people arrived for the veterans event.
Word was spreading quickly through the community, and soon there were dozens of people gathered around, all trying to get the details of what was happening. Sarah could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, and she began to wonder if she should just leave before things got worse.
But leaving would only confirm what Marcus was already telling everyone who would listen. If she walked away now, the story would spread throughout the town and beyond, with no chance for her to defend herself or set the record straight. The morning that had started with such promise, with Sarah excited to help honor the service of local veterans, had turned into a nightmare that threatened to destroy her reputation and peace of mind. As she stood in the center of the hostile crowd, she couldn't help but think about all the challenges she had faced to earn that tattoo, and how cruel it was that the same symbol of her achievement was now being used to attack her character. She had no way of knowing that this confrontation was about to take a turn that would surprise everyone involved, including Marcus Webb. But for now, all she could do was stand her ground and hope that somehow the truth would find a way to emerge. The confrontation at the community center continued to escalate as more people arrived for the veterans event. Marcus Webb had become the unofficial leader of those who believed Sarah was guilty of stolen valor, and he was enjoying his moment in the spotlight. He had pulled up several articles on his phone about the Navy SEALs and was reading passages aloud to anyone who would listen. According to this Department of Defense report, Marcus announced, holding his phone high so everyone could see, no woman has ever successfully completed basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. It says right here that the physical requirements are designed for male physiology. So explain to me how this girl could have earned a SEAL trident when the Navy itself says it's impossible. Sarah listened to his speech with growing frustration. She knew that Marcus was technically correct about women not having completed traditional SEAL training, but he was missing crucial information that would change everything if he knew it. However, she also knew that revealing certain details about her service could put other people at risk, which was why she had always kept quiet about her military background. Betty, the woman with 2 sons in the Army, was becoming increasingly angry as she listened to Marcus's presentation. This is exactly what's wrong with our country today, she said loudly. People think they can just pretend to be heroes without putting in the work. My boys are over in Afghanistan right now, missing birthdays and holidays, while girls like this are back home playing soldier with fake tattoos. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Sarah could see that public opinion was firmly against her. Even people who had arrived late and didn't know the full story were quickly taking sides based on the explanations they were hearing from Marcus and his supporters. Frank, the Korean War veteran, made another attempt to calm things down. Look, everyone, maybe we're getting a little carried away here. This is supposed to be a day to honor veterans, not to tear each other apart. Why don't we just agree to disagree and focus on the event? But a younger man named Dave, who claimed to have served in the Marines, stepped forward aggressively. No way, old-timer. Stolen valor is a serious issue. I spent 4 years in the Corps, and I saw guys die for their country. I'm not going to stand here and watch some wannabe disrespect their memory by wearing insignia she didn't earn. Sarah realized that the situation was becoming dangerous. The crowd was getting larger and more hostile, and she was beginning to fear for her physical safety. Several people were now taking photos and videos with their phones, and she knew that within hours the images would be shared across social media platforms with captions declaring her a fraud. Mrs. Johnson, the community center director, was clearly overwhelmed by the situation. She had expected to spend the morning setting up tables and greeting veterans, not managing an angry mob. She looked around desperately for someone who might be able to restore order, but most of the volunteers were either participating in the confrontation or backing away to avoid getting involved. I think we need to call the police, Mrs. Johnson whispered to her assistant. This is getting out of hand. Marcus overheard her and immediately objected. We don't need police to handle a stolen valor case. What we need is for this woman to admit she's a fraud and apologize to every real veteran here. Then maybe we can all move on. Sarah's training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but she was reaching her breaking point. She had spent years serving her country in ways that most people couldn't imagine, sacrificing time with family and friends, missing holidays and birthdays,
putting herself in dangerous situations that she could never discuss publicly. And now she was being attacked by people who had no idea what she had given up in service to her nation. "You want proof?" she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the chatter of the crowd. "Fine, let me make a phone call." Marcus laughed mockingly. "Oh, let me guess. You're going to call your commanding officer who will magically verify your fake service?" "Lady, we weren't born yesterday." But Sarah was already dialing a number she knew by heart. The crowd fell silent as they waited to see what would happen next. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered on the other end. "Commander Richards," the voice said simply. "Commander, this is Sarah Martinez," she said, putting the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. "I'm sorry to bother you on a weekend, but I'm in a situation where I need you to verify my service record. There are people here who don't believe I earned my qualifications." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Martinez, you know I can't discuss classified operations over an unsecured line. Where are you and who's asking?" Sarah explained the situation quickly, describing the confrontation at the community center and the accusations being made against her. As she spoke, the crowd listened intently, trying to determine whether the conversation was real or if this was some elaborate performance designed to fool them. "Commander, is there anything you can say that would help clear this up without compromising operational security?" Sarah asked. Commander Richards was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could imagine him weighing his options. Finally, he spoke in a measured tone that carried the authority of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "I can confirm that Petty Officer Martinez served with distinction in Naval Special Operations. Her record is exemplary, and she earned every qualification she was awarded. Anyone questioning her service is seriously mistaken." The crowd was stunned into silence. Marcus was the first to recover, but his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Wait a minute. You said Petty Officer Martinez. If she was in Special Operations, why didn't she just say she was in the SEALs?" "Because she wasn't in the SEALs, you idiot," Commander Richards replied sharply. "She was in something that makes the SEALs look like a high school swim team. But since that program doesn't officially exist, she can't discuss it publicly. The fact that she's even talking to me about this on an open line is already pushing the boundaries of what's allowed." Marcus was clearly confused, and several people in the crowd began whispering among themselves. The confident accusations were starting to give way to uncertainty and doubt. "But the tattoo," Betty protested. "She's wearing a SEAL trident. If she wasn't a SEAL, why does she have that tattoo?" Commander Richards sighed audibly through the phone. "Ma'am, that's not a SEAL trident. That's the insignia for a special operations unit that operates under such deep classification that most people in the Navy don't even know it exists. The fact that you think it's a SEAL trident just shows how little you understand about naval special operations." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she heard the commander explaining what she had been unable to say herself. For 3 years, she had carried the burden of serving in a unit so classified that she couldn't even acknowledge its existence, let alone discuss her role in it. Frank, the Korean War veteran, stepped forward with an expression of growing understanding. "Young lady, I owe you an apology. We all do. We should never have questioned your service without knowing the fact." But Marcus wasn't ready to give up. His entire argument had been based on his supposed expertise in military affairs, and admitting he was wrong would undermine his credibility in front of everyone. "How do we know this phone call is real? This could all be an elaborate setup. I still think something doesn't add up here." Commander Richards apparently heard this comment because his voice came through the phone speaker with unmistakable irritation. "Son, who is that questioning the integrity of a classified operation?" Marcus suddenly looked much less confident as he realized he might have just challenged a high-ranking military officer. I'm just trying to protect our veterans from people who fake their service." "Well, you've done a fine job of harassing one of our most decorated operators," the commander replied coldly. "Petty Officer Martinez has more combat experience than most Navy SEALs, and she's earned honors that she'll never be able to display publicly because of the classified nature of her service. So maybe next time, before you start throwing around accusations, you should consider that there might be things you don't understand." The crowd was now completely silent, and many people were looking at Marcus with expressions of disapproval and embarrassment. Sarah could see that the tide of opinion had turned decisively in her favor.
but she took no satisfaction in Marcus's humiliation. She knew how it felt to be publicly embarrassed, and she wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. Dave, the man who had claimed to be a Marine veteran, stepped forward with his head down. "Ma'am, I owe you a serious apology. I said some things that were way out of line. Thank you for your service, and I'm sorry we put you through this." One by one, other members of the crowd began offering their own apologies. Mrs. Johnson looked relieved that the situation was finally being resolved, though she was clearly shaken by how quickly things had gotten out of hand. "Commander," Sarah said into the phone, "I think the situation here is under control now. Thank you for backing me up."
"Martinez, you shouldn't have had to deal with that nonsense in the first place. These people have no idea what you've sacrificed for this country."
Try to enjoy your civilian life and don't let ignorant civilians get under your skin. After hanging up, Sarah stood quietly for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. The morning had started so simply, with her looking forward to helping honor local veterans. Instead, she had been forced to reveal more about her service than she had ever intended to share publicly. Marcus was still standing nearby, but his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. He looked around at the crowd of people who were now treating Sarah with obvious respect and admiration, and he seemed to realize that his attempt to expose a fraud had backfired spectacularly. I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly to no one in particular. "I really believed she was faking it." Sarah walked over to him, and everyone watched to see what she would say. Marcus looked up at her with a mixture of shame and fear, clearly expecting to be publicly humiliated in return for what he had put her through. "Marcus," she said gently, "I understand why you were upset. Stolen valor is a real problem, and veterans deserve to have their service respected and protected. You were trying to stand up for people you thought had been wronged. I can't fault you for that, even though your approach was pretty harsh." Marcus looked surprised by her gracious response. "But I was wrong about everything. I accused you of being a fraud when you're actually some kind of special operations hero." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who did a job that needed to be done. And you weren't completely wrong to be suspicious. The tattoo does look like a seal trident if you don't know the differences. Most people wouldn't be able to tell them apart." Betty stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Honey, I said some terrible things about you. I compared you to my sons, and I was so wrong. Will you forgive me?" Sarah nodded and gave her a brief hug. "Of course. You were defending your boys. I understand that completely." As more people approached to apologize and thank her for her service, Sarah began to feel overwhelmed by the attention. She had spent years keeping a low profile specifically to avoid situations like this, and now she was being treated like a celebrity by people who had been ready to run her out of town just minutes earlier. Mrs. Johnson approached with a grateful smile. "Sarah, I can't tell you how sorry I am about all this. Is there anything I can do to make it up to you?" "Actually," Sarah said, looking around at the group of volunteers, "there is something. This event is supposed to honor veterans, and we've spent the morning arguing instead of setting up. Why don't we all work together to make sure our local veterans have the celebration they deserve?" The crowd immediately agreed, and people began moving quickly to finish the preparations that had been interrupted by the confrontation. The energy was completely different now, with everyone working together enthusiastically instead of standing around arguing. As Sarah picked up folding chairs and began arranging them in neat rows, she reflected on how quickly the situation had changed. One phone call had transformed her from an accused fraud into a respected veteran, but she knew that the underlying issues that had caused the confrontation were still present in the community. She also knew that her conversation with Commander Richards had revealed more about her service than she had ever intended to share publicly. The classified nature of her work meant that she would probably face questions from her former superiors about the security implications of the day's events. But for now, she was just grateful that the truth had finally come out, and that she could continue her quiet civilian life without constantly looking over her shoulder for people like Marcus Webb. The Veterans event was shaping up to be a success, and that was what really mattered. The Veterans event proceeded much more smoothly after the confrontation was resolved, but Sarah noticed that she had become something of a celebrity among the attendees. Word had spread quickly about what had happened, and veterans who arrived throughout the day
sought her out to shake her hand and thank her for her service.
The attention made her uncomfortable as she had spent years deliberately maintaining a low profile. During the lunch break, an elderly man in a wheelchair approached her table. He wore a baseball cap with Vietnam veteran embroidered on the front, and his weathered hands showed the signs of someone who had worked hard his entire life. His name tag read Robert Chen, and he moved his wheelchair with practiced ease through the crowded room.
"Excuse me, Miss Martinez," he said politely. "I hope you don't mind, but I heard about what happened this morning. I wanted to personally apologize for how you were treated and thank you for your service." Sarah stood up and shook his hand warmly. "Please, call me Sarah." "And thank you, Mr. Chen. I appreciate your support, but really, I was just doing my job like thousands of other service members." Robert smiled and gestured for her to sit back down. "Mind if an old soldier joined you for a few minutes? I have a story I think you might appreciate." Sarah nodded and moved over to make room for his wheelchair beside her chair. She was always honored to listen to stories from older veterans, particularly those who had served in Vietnam during such a difficult and controversial time in American history. "You know," Robert began, "I spent 13 months in Vietnam as a combat engineer. When I came home in 1969, people at the airport spat on me and called me a baby killer. For years, I couldn't talk about my service without getting into arguments about politics and war protests. It got so bad that I just stopped mentioning I was a veteran at all." Sarah nodded sympathetically. She had heard similar stories from other Vietnam veterans, and she knew that many of them had suffered not only from their combat experiences, but also from the hostile reception they received when they returned home. "The thing is," Robert continued, "I never blamed the protesters for their anger about the war. They had every right to oppose government policies they disagreed with. What hurt was when they took that anger out on individual soldiers who were just following orders and trying to serve their country." "I can imagine how painful that must have been," Sarah said. "You deserved better treatment when you came home." Robert leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair. "What happened to you this morning reminded me of those experiences. People making assumptions about your service based on incomplete information and their own biases. The difference is that you had someone who could speak up for you and set the record straight. Most of us Vietnam veterans had to wait decades before people started treating us with respect." Sarah hadn't considered the comparison before, but she could see the parallels Robert was drawing. Both situations involved people making judgments about military service based on their own preconceptions rather than actual facts. "The other thing that struck me," Robert continued, "is how that man Marcus was so confident in his accusations. He reminded me of the war protesters who used to lecture me about what I had supposedly done in Vietnam, even though they had never been there themselves. They were absolutely certain they knew more about my experiences than I did." As they talked, other veterans began joining their table. Word had spread that Robert was sharing stories about Vietnam, and older veterans often gravitated toward each other at these events. Sarah found herself surrounded by men and women who had served in conflicts ranging from Korea to Afghanistan, each with their own perspective on military service and civilian understanding of warfare. "I'll tell you what bothers me most about this whole situation," said Maria Gonzalez, a Gulf War veteran who had served as a combat medic. "That man Marcus thought he could determine who was and wasn't qualified to wear military insignia based on what he read on the internet. But he had no idea what actual military service involves." An older man named James, who had served in the Navy during the Cold War, nodded in agreement. "I've noticed that the people who are quickest to question other people's service are usually the ones who never served themselves. Real veterans understand that military service comes in many different forms, and we don't usually feel the need to quiz each other about our qualifications." Sarah appreciated the support from the veteran community, but she was also concerned about the broader implications of what had happened. The confrontation had revealed some uncomfortable truths about how civilians perceived military service and how quickly people were willing to believe accusations of stolen valor. "The thing that worries me," she said, "is that this kind of public accusation can destroy someone's reputation, even if it turns out to be false. If Commander Richards hadn't been available to take my call, or if my service had been in a unit that couldn't be verified publicly, I might never have been able to clear my name." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly right. These accusations spread much faster than corrections do. Social media makes it even worse. because people can share stories without checking facts first. By the time the truth comes out, the damage is already done. Marcus Webb had remained at the event after the confrontation, helping with setup and cleanup tasks, but he kept a low profile and avoided making eye contact with Sarah or the other veterans. Several people noticed his changed demeanor and began discussing whether he was genuinely remorseful or just embarrassed about being wrong. "I feel kind of sorry for the guy," said Maria. He obviously feels terrible about what happened, and to his credit, he stayed to help instead of just slinking away when he realized he'd made a mistake. James was less sympathetic. Maybe he'll think twice before publicly accusing someone of stolen valor without knowing the facts. This could have turned out much worse if Sarah hadn't been able to prove her service. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah noticed that Marcus was gradually working his way closer to the table where she was sitting with the other veterans. He seemed to be building up the courage to approach, but he kept hesitating and finding other tasks that needed his attention. Finally, during a quiet moment when most people were focused on the keynote speaker's presentation, Marcus walked over to where Sarah was sitting. His face was red with embarrassment, and his hands shook slightly as he approached. "Sarah, I know I already apologized this morning, but I wanted to say something else," he began nervously. "I've been thinking about what happened, and I realized that I made some serious mistakes that go beyond just being wrong about your service." Sarah gestured for him to sit down in an empty chair beside her. "What do you mean, Marcus?" He took a deep breath before continuing. "I mean that I was so focused on proving I was right that I forgot to treat you like a human being. I turned your personal military service into a public spectacle, and that was wrong regardless of whether you were a veteran or not. You didn't deserve to be humiliated in front of a crowd of people." Robert, who had been listening to the conversation, spoke up. "Son, it takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake, especially in front of the people you wronged. I respect you for coming over here to apologize properly." Marcus looked grateful for Robert's words, but his expression remained serious. "The thing is, I've been researching stolen valor cases online for months, and I guess I got caught up in the idea of being the person who exposed a fraud. It made me feel important, like I was protecting veterans from people who didn't deserve respect." "That's a dangerous mindset," Maria observed. "When you start looking for problems everywhere, you're bound to see them even when they don't exist. It becomes like a witch hunt where innocent people get caught up in false accusations." Sarah had been listening quietly, but now she leaned forward to address Marcus directly. "Marcus, can I ask you something? What made you so passionate about military issues in the first place? You obviously care deeply about honoring veterans, or you wouldn't have gotten so upset about what you thought was stolen valor." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see that her question had touched on something personal. "My grandfather was a World War II veteran. He stormed the beaches at Normandy and earned a Purple Heart. When I was growing up, he was my hero, and he used to tell me stories about his service and the men he served with. That's a wonderful legacy," James said. "Your grandfather sounds like he was an exceptional man." "He was," Marcus continued, "but he died when I was in high school, before I was old enough to really appreciate what he had done. By the time I realized I wanted to follow in his footsteps and join the military, I had developed some health problems that disqualified me from service. I guess I've spent the last few years trying to honor his memory by protecting the reputation of military service, but I went about it all wrong." Sarah felt a wave of sympathy for Marcus as she began to understand his motivation. "Marcus, honoring your grandfather's memory is a noble goal, but the way to do that isn't by attacking people you suspect of lying about their service. The way to do that is by supporting real veterans and helping people understand what military service actually involves." Robert reached over and patted Marcus on the shoulder. "Young man, there are plenty of ways to support veterans without ever putting on a uniform. You could volunteer at VA hospitals, help veterans find jobs, support military families while their loved ones are deployed. Your grandfather would be proud of you for wanting to serve, even if you can't do it in the traditional way." As the conversation continued, Sarah was struck by how much her understanding of the morning's events was evolving. What had started as a simple case of mistaken identity had revealed complex layers of motivation and emotion that went far beyond the surface-level accusations. Marcus wasn't just a troublemaker looking for attention. He was someone struggling with his own feelings of inadequacy about not being able to serve in the military like his grandfather. His aggressive confrontation with Sarah had been misguided, but it came from a genuine desire to protect something he valued deeply. "Marcus," Sarah said, "I want you to know that I don't hold any grudges about what happened this morning. You made a mistake, but you've acknowledged it and apologized sincerely. That's more than a lot of people would do in your situation." Marcus looked visibly relieved. "Thank you, Sarah. That means more to me than you know. I promise you that I'll never make assumptions about someone's military service again without having all the facts." More importantly, Maria added, "Maybe you could use this experience to educate other people about the dangers of making false accusations. You could become an advocate for treating veterans with respect while also being careful about jumping to conclusions." The idea seemed to appeal to Marcus, and Sarah could see that he was already thinking about how he might turn his mistake into an opportunity to help others avoid similar situations. As the veterans event began winding down in the early evening, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since the morning's confrontation. What had started as one of the worst experiences of her civilian life had turned into an opportunity for education, understanding, and personal growth for everyone involved. She had also gained a new appreciation for the veteran community and the way they supported each other through difficult times. The older veterans at her table had not only defended her against unfair accusations, but they had also shown compassion for Marcus and helped him understand how he could channel his passion for military service in more positive directions. The classified nature of her service would always make it difficult for her to discuss her military background openly, but today had shown her that there were ways to handle questions and challenges without completely isolating herself from the veteran community. As she helped clean up the community center after the event, Sarah knew that word of the day's events would spread throughout the town and beyond. But instead of the negative stolen valor story that Marcus had originally intended to publicize, the narrative would now focus on the importance of treating veterans with respect and the dangers of making accusations without sufficient evidence. It wasn't the quiet, anonymous life she had planned when she moved to this small Texas town, but it was a life she could live with dignity and pride. 3 weeks after the veterans event, Sarah was leading her morning boot camp class when she noticed a familiar figure standing outside the community center. Commander Richards was leaning against a black SUV, wearing civilian clothes but maintaining the unmistakable posture of someone with decades of military service. She wrapped up the class quickly and walked over to meet him, wondering what had brought her former commanding officer to her small Texas town. "Commander, this is unexpected," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "Is everything all right?" He shook her hand firmly and gestured toward a nearby bench. "We need to talk, Martinez. The phone call you had me make a few weeks ago has created some complications that we need to discuss." Sarah's heart sank as she sat down beside him. She had suspected that revealing details about her classified service might have consequences, but she had hoped that the matter would be forgotten quickly. "How much trouble am I in, sir?" Commander Richards was quiet for a moment, watching the early morning joggers pass by on the community center's walking trail. "It's complicated. On one hand, you handled a difficult situation about as well as anyone could have expected. You didn't reveal any operational details, and you protected the integrity of the program while defending yourself against false accusations. But," Sarah prompted, sensing there was more to the story, "but your little confrontation didn't stay local like we hoped it would. Someone recorded video of parts of the incident, and it's been shared across social media platforms. We've got Pentagon officials asking questions about security protocols, and there are journalists trying to figure out what classified unit you served with." Sarah felt sick to her stomach. The last thing she had ever wanted was to draw national attention to her service, or to compromise the security of her former unit. "Commander, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to defend myself against accusations of stolen valor." "I know," he said, his tone softening slightly. "And honestly, you shouldn't have been put in that position in the first place. The security protocols for veterans of classified units are inadequate, and this incident has highlighted some serious gaps in how we protect our people after they transition to civilian life." A jogger passed by and nodded to them politely, completely unaware that he was witnessing a conversation about some of the most classified operations in military history. Sarah waved back automatically, still processing what the commander had told her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Do I need to relocate? Change my identity? I've been trying to build a life here, and I finally feel like I'm finding my place in this community." Commander Richards studied her face carefully before responding. That depends partly on you.
The Pentagon is considering two options. The first is to relocate you under a new identity and pretend this incident never happened. The second is to use this situation as an opportunity to create better support systems for veterans of classified programs. Sarah was intrigued by the second option, but also wary of what it might involve. What would that look like exactly? We'd work with you to develop a standardized response for veterans who find themselves in similar situations. Instead of every former operator having to figure out how to handle questions about their service on their own, they'd have official protocols and support from the Department of Defense. You'd essentially become a test case for how to balance operational security with the need to protect veterans from stolen valor accusations. The idea appealed to Sarah because it would help other veterans avoid the humiliation and stress she had experienced. But she also knew that accepting such a role would mean giving up the anonymity she had worked so hard to achieve. Would I be able to stay here and continue my current job? She asked. Yes, but with some modifications. You'd need to work with military public affairs specialists to develop appropriate responses to media inquiries. You'd also need to be available for consultation when other veterans of classified programs face similar challenges. Before Sarah could respond, she noticed Marcus Webb walking across the parking lot toward them. He had been coming to her boot camp classes for the past 2 weeks, partly as a way to get in shape, and partly as an ongoing apology for the way he had treated her. She had grown to appreciate his dedication and his genuine efforts to make amends. "Sarah, I don't want to interrupt," Marcus said as he approached, "but I wanted to let you know that a reporter from the Dallas Morning News called me yesterday. She's working on a story about what happened at the Veterans event, and she wanted my side of the story." Commander Richards immediately became alert. "What did you tell her?" Marcus looked back and forth between Sarah and the commander, clearly sensing that he had walked into an important conversation. "I told her that I had made a serious mistake by accusing Sarah of stolen valor, and that she's a genuine veteran who deserves respect. I refused to provide any details about what was said during the phone call because I figured that was private military business. That was the right thing to do," the commander said approvingly. "But the fact that reporters are investigating this story confirms what we suspected. This incident isn't going away quietly." Sarah made a quick decision. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Commander Richards. He's the officer who spoke on the phone that day. Commander, this is Marcus Webb, the man who originally challenged my service." The two men shook hands, and Sarah could see Marcus becoming nervous as he realized he was meeting a high-ranking military officer who had witnessed his accusations against Sarah. "Sir, I owe you an apology as well," Marcus said formally. "I questioned the integrity of military operations I knew nothing about, and I'm ashamed of my behavior that day." Commander Richards studied Marcus for a moment before responding. "Mr. Webb, your actions that morning were misguided, but they've inadvertently helped us identify a serious problem with how we support veterans of classified programs. In a strange way, you may have done the military a favor by exposing this issue." Marcus looked confused. "I'm not sure I understand, sir." "The problem," the commander explained, "is that we have hundreds of veterans who served in classified units, and they're all vulnerable to the same kind of accusations Sarah faced. Most of them don't have the option of calling a former commanding officer to verify their service, because their units officially don't exist. We need better systems to protect these veterans while maintaining operational security." Sarah could see that Marcus was beginning to understand the broader implications of what had happened. "Is there anything I can do to help fix this problem?" he asked. "I feel responsible for putting Sarah in this position, and I'd like to make it right if I can." Commander Richards exchanged a look with Sarah before answering. "Actually, there might be. If Sarah agrees to work with us on developing new protocols, we could use someone from the civilian community to help us understand how these situations develop and how to prevent them." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Johnson, the community center director, who approached them with a concerned expression. "Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you, but there are 2 reporters in the lobby asking questions about the incident at the Veterans event. They want to interview you and several other people who were there that day." Sarah looked at Commander Richards, who nodded grimly. "It's starting. The story is about to break whether we're ready for it or not." "Mrs. Johnson," Sarah said, "please tell the reporters that I'm not available for interviews right now, but that I'll have a statement for them later today." After Mrs. Johnson left,
Commander Richard stood up and began walking toward his SUV. Martinez, I need to make some phone calls to Washington. This timeline has just accelerated significantly. I need to know your decision about whether you're willing to work with us on this project. Sarah thought about everything she had built in this small Texas town over the past 2 years. She had found peace working at the community center, helping people achieve their fitness goals, and living a quiet life away from the intensity of military operations. Taking on a role as a spokesperson for veterans of classified programs would mean giving up that peaceful anonymity. But she also thought about the other veterans who were probably struggling with the same issues she had faced. How many of them had been falsely accused of stolen valor with no way to defend themselves? How many had simply stopped wearing anything that might identify them as veterans to avoid confrontation? Commander, she said finally, if we do this, I want Marcus involved in developing the civilian education component. The people who make these false accusations aren't evil, they're just uninformed. If we can help them understand the complexities of military service, especially classified service, we might be able to prevent these situations before they start. Marcus looked surprised and grateful. Sarah? Are you sure? I'm the one who caused this whole mess in the first place. Exactly, she replied. That makes you the perfect person to help others understand how these misunderstandings develop. You've been on both sides of this issue now, and you understand both the passion that drives people to protect military service and the damage that false accusations can cause. Commander Richards considered this proposal as he unlocked his SUV. It's unconventional, but it might work. The Pentagon has been struggling to find ways to bridge the civilian-military divide. Having someone like Mr. Webb involved might help us develop more effective approaches. Over the following hours, Sarah's quiet morning turned into a whirlwind of phone calls and meetings. Pentagon officials wanted briefings on the incident, public affairs specialists needed to develop press strategies, and journalists were calling everyone who had been at the veterans event. By evening, Sarah found herself sitting in a hotel conference room with a team of military and civilian officials, working on a comprehensive plan to address the challenges faced by veterans of classified programs. Marcus had been invited to join the discussion, and his insights into the civilian perspective were proving valuable. The key issue, said Colonel Patricia Hayes, the Pentagon's liaison for the project, is that we need to protect operational security while also protecting our veterans from harassment. These two goals have been in conflict, but this incident shows us that we need to find a way to achieve both. A civilian researcher named Dr. Jennifer Park had been brought in to provide expertise on social media and public perception. The stolen valor accusation videos go viral very quickly, she explained, but corrections and retractions rarely get the same level of attention. We need to get ahead of these stories instead of just reacting to them after the damage is done. As the meeting progressed, Sarah began to see how the traumatic experience at the community center might ultimately lead to positive changes for thousands of veterans. The attention was unwelcome and the loss of privacy was difficult, but the potential to help other veterans made the sacrifices worthwhile. Late that night, as Sarah drove home through the quiet streets of her small town, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. The peaceful anonymity she had cherished was gone forever, but in its place was an opportunity to serve her fellow veterans in a new way. The next morning's newspapers would carry the first detailed reports about the incident, and she knew that her story would soon be known across the country. But she was no longer afraid of the attention. She had found her purpose again, and she was ready to fight for the veterans who had served their country in the shadows, protecting them from the very people they had sworn to defend.